Welcome to this edition of the ClaVille Report. I'm your host, Dr. Eric ClaVille, where we talk about policy, law, and politics. On this episode, we're going to look at a very important aspect of American political system, and that is the rise of the third party. Now, if you're like me, from the moment you probably came into this world, we've had two major parties in our political system. More specifically, the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, throughout history, we've had Federalists, we've had Whigs, we've had independents run, but really nothing has really taken hold in our society. There may be a reason for that, and we're going to take a look and delve into and understanding why that actually may be. But the question now becomes, why is a third party right now so viable? Or is it viable? In our winner-take-all system, many times what happens is that we end up deciding to vote against our own best interest only because we don't like the other group, or vice versa. But does that really help us? Does that really help our system of democracy? Many would say that democracy itself would be destroyed if we had different parties or multiple parties. But keep in mind, across the world, we have a process called, or an actual political system called parliamentarian, where we have many different groups, many different factions of society that actually are represented in Congress or in their body, their governing body, and they're representing their interests. Now, they may not be the majority, but they're representing their interests. And at least the individuals who are representing them and their interests have a voice. And we see the ability to build coalitions. Whoever becomes the leader of that country, whether it be a prime minister or a president or whatever the case may be, they have to build coalition. They have to reach across the aisle. They have to. It's not, it's just not an option. So would our system be better with a multi-party system? Would it be better with a third party that rises to the top to really compete with the Republican and Democratic Party, the two stalwarts or the standards of our political system? These are all very important questions that we have to answer. And I believe that in this society that we have today, in the society of what is called extremisms, individuals that are more progressive, more extreme right, extreme left, or even those that are centrist, this is a question that is coming up that is not going anywhere. But before we take a deep dive into what helped to create this new phenomenon, or we could say new phenomenon in our country or recent phenomenon, first I want to take a look at if we do have a third party, can it really survive? I want us to take a look at this clip by historian Manjur Z before we delve into that.
The party system of the United States has often been the subject of great criticism by both American citizens and those abroad. These critiques tend to break down along four main points. One is the issue of polarization, the claim that if only two parties exist, they're likely to adopt policies existing on opposite sides of the spectrum, making compromise far more difficult and national progress toward either party's goals impossible, as each changing administration would then work to undo the achievements of the prior. Second, and in contrast to the first critique, is that a two-party system creates an illusion of choice, that the two parties at the end of the day are basically the same, that meaning in the modern sense that both Republicans and Democrat politicians are just self-interested globalists in the pockets of major corporations and elite groups. Mind you, this is something held by both people on the right and left, both of whom have historically attempted to remedy this by supporting third parties or non-establishment candidates like Donald Trump in the case of conservatives or Bernie Sanders in the case of the left wing. And we often find active roadblocks put in place by the establishment to prevent the non-establishment faction from competing on equal footing. Thirdly, there is the matter that with only two parties, both sides are attempting to maximize their total voter appeal and as such widen their platform to be more inclusive of niche demographics or interest groups, and in doing so no longer specialize or focus on major or even controversial issues. Controversial issues especially being swept under the rug until they become far too large to ignore. This feeds into the prior point of the establishment Democrats and Republicans gradually adopting similar platforms in order to attempt to steal voters away from the other side. Fourth, and perhaps harkening back to the first criticism, is that in a polarized two-party winner-take-all system, you can have a situation in which 51% of the population tramples over the rights of the remaining 49. But now we're uncovering a secondary aspect that goes beyond having more than two parties. Sure, you can have a large third and fourth party which breaks the national vote roughly into quarters. But under normal circumstances, and assuming representation is our prime concern here, this could be even worse, as you now have just over 25% of the population deciding who becomes president for the whole country. In the UK and some of its former colonies, such as Canada, we see the use of the first-past-the-post system, where the party which wins not necessarily a majority of parliamentary seats but a plurality of said seats is deemed the winner, and their leader assumes, in the case of the UK, the title of Prime Minister. Mind you, this is a system used primarily in parliamentary governments, and though it could be translated to fit the United States, it doesn't achieve a very different result, not to mention it would likely demand a restructuring of how the president is elected, which could become a constitutional issue all on its own. These election systems offer a little bit more variety in terms of larger secondary parties, but generally there's really only two main choices who receive the bulk of votes, while the rest remain minor factions who at best win local elections, but not national elections. Thus, merely having larger alternative parties does not remedy desires for more representation. What might be opted for instead is the substitution of the plurality or majority system for a proportional representation system. This is a system in which a party receiving perhaps only 5% of the votes still receives some representation in government instead of losing outright. In a system where representation can be achieved by even small niche demographics or specific interest groups, there's automatically a great incentive to create your own political faction to specifically represent you and your group, instead of being a small voice in a catch-all big tent party. But exactly what groups in the United States are most likely to form their own political parties? How much power would they hold, and just what would the system mean for the US if it were implemented?
You know, with that, we understand that there are issues that are facing the existence of a third party, whether it be tradition, whether it be finances, whether it be political influence upon corporations and the establishment. But one thing that is undeniable is that there has always been a desire for a third party, another option. We saw this play out in the last election cycle, 2016. I would even go back as far as maybe 2008, when we had the rise of what we call the Tea Party. We had the rise of Occupy Wall Street. These events that led to desperation, or people that realize, American citizens, that realize that the current political system does not represent them fully and their interests, needed another voice. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, having another voice that represents you. But let's take a deep dive into this. I want to look at this from three various aspects. One aspect from a people's movement, or what we call a leftist movement, one from a centrist movement, and one from an extreme right movement, one that is more militant in its take. Let's look at the rise of people's parties. Now, we can go as far back as the 60s, during the time of Fred Hampton, who was the founder of the Chicago arm of the Black Panthers. But he also founded a multicultural group called the Rainbow Coalition. Now, most of us may think, we think about the Rainbow Coalition, we think about Reverend Jesse Jackson and his coalition that he used to galvanize people around issues, very similar issues, but more specifically African Americans. And he used that coalition to run for president in 1984 and 1988. And we can't forget about Shirley Chisholm, who was the first African American and first woman to seek the nomination of a major party for president. But Fred Hampton did something that we really haven't seen since, if you really think about it. He helped to create a political organization, which included the Black Panthers, which some mistakenly created as or looked upon and categorized as a terrorist group. But in actuality, we see now through historical records that the Black Panthers were created for themselves and to protection of their community, feeding programs for children in their community, and really speaking to the needs of people in their community. Also, it was formed by a group included the Young Patriots and the Young Lords and other gangs, street gangs within the Chicago area. But again, the key to this is multicultural. The Young Patriots was a majority white group. These individuals believe that government itself was not speaking to them. They represented mostly white Southerners. I mean, think about that. White Southerners coming together with a Black Panther out of Chicago. White migrants coming together under this umbrella, and the white migrants of extreme poverty, discrimination, largely in the Appalachian region and the like. These individuals came together to speak against a system that wasn't speaking for them, and to speak for issues in which the system was not speaking to them. Think about that. I mean, that is key. Their main focus was issues of extreme poverty, discrimination, and helping and also what we call the anti-capitalist movement, right? So anti-capitalist, anti-racist. Again, these individuals saying, hey, capitalism doesn't work for us. It works for the very well-to-do, the very well-educated in most part, but individuals with money, that's who capitalism works for. It doesn't work for the common man. In other words, the base of that pyramid was getting the brunt of issues and the brunt of the lack of resources, as opposed to those at the very top, at the capstone. Sounds familiar today? Well, let's go a little bit further. Now, keep in mind that group was ahead of their time. But let's look at now at the Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's Campaign that's led primarily by Reverend Barber, who is a former president of NAACP or NAACP in North Carolina. He's one of the main figures in this particular movement. A Poor People's Campaign, looking for moral action, right? Poor People's Campaign, Moral Action Congress. These are individuals that are saying that, again, there are individuals in our country, people, groups in our country that are poor, that don't have the resources. They're good people. They're hardworking people. They get up and work every day. They go work 40 hours a day on their job. They're making minimum wage, but they're not making ends meet. Prices keep going up. Lack of affordable housing in their communities. And issues affecting poor people. These are the issues. Poor schools, poor instructions, poor teachers, lack of resources, the constant destroying and peeling back of social programs to help people, give them a hand up as opposed to a hand out. They're being eliminated. So this particular group is saying to the majority, we need someone representing our interests. When bills are drawn up in Congress, and there's an idea that comes, more likely those ideas do come from special interests, corporate interests, banking interests, military interests, big energy, big oil interests. And some come from interests of people on the street, right? The question becomes, where are the representatives to represent the people? What they're saying is that we need people that are representing us at the table. We need people who are there representing our interests at the table. We need people who speak the lingo of everyday working men and women at the table. We need individuals that care about the future of our society and our children at the table, not just their children, but all of our children. That's what the Poor People's Campaign movement, the Poor People's Moral Action Congress, that's what they're saying. That's what they are asking for. That's the reason why they formed. But think about it. The Rainbow Coalition, a coalition of African Americans, a coalition of white Southerners, a coalition of poor whites, surrounding around and organizing around issues of poverty. Keep in mind, poverty has no color, poverty has no race, poverty knows no state boundaries or lines. Poverty is poverty. If you don't have, then you simply don't have. And many of our communities are struggling because they simply don't have. And that's why they're organizing. That's why they're saying, we need our interests represented. This is the reason for it. Well, let's dig a little deeper. Now we're looking at another movement, and it's called the People's Party movement. This particular group, again, surrounded around or created around a group of issues, primarily dealing with community, but also dealing with issues around environment, dealing with issues around discrimination for other groups as well. They're saying that we need this party. We need this group because our issues are not at the forefront. And more specifically, this particular group is saying that corporate America is failing America, that special interest is failing America, that the greed of banks, corporate America and Wall Street is killing America. So they're creating a platform around economic Bill of Rights, unions, and workplace democracy, infrastructure, fair tax for small businesses, reining in and create Wall Street and creating public banks, fair trade, abolishing and corruption and restoring democracy, secure elections, defending civil rights, Medicare for all, free public college and education, immigration, comprehensive immigration reform, respect for people with disabilities, animal rights, environmental rights, social justice rights. Again, and also ensuring that our veterans are taken care of. Now that seems like a very big umbrella, right? But when you boil it down, all these issues affect our country. All these issues affect everyday citizens. All these issues affect every single person in our country. But the question becomes, can we galvanize around such a big tent or umbrella? But they're saying, this is the people's movement. This is the reason why we need a third party. Focus squarely on the people. Now, we've talked about and we've analyzed groups that are forming, that have formed in the past and are forming now, centered around issues of people outside of the two established parties. By the way, the People's Party, they actually were recruiting Bernie Sanders to be their candidate for president, which, if Bernie Sanders thinks about it, it may not be a bad idea to entertain it, given the fact that he's not been able to break through the traditional party, which is a great segue to talking about the traditional parties. These groups are third parties outside of the political spectrum, outside the political norm. Now let's take a look at the two establishment parties. Let's look at the Democrats first, and then we'll take a look at the Republican Party, which I think is going through a major restructuring. The Democrats are not there just yet, but they're going to get there. Even within the two major parties, you have factions that are holding these parties together, being held together by a piece of thread. And when we talk about the Democratic Party, I'm speaking of the traditional Democrats and what we call the progressive arm of the Democratic Party. The traditional Democrats are, your blue dog Democrats like your Bill Clintons and your Joe Manchins, your traditional East Coast Democrats like your Joe Bidens and the like. These are individuals, and also your West Coast Democrats like your Nancy Pelosi's. And then you have your stalwart Democrats of the African American parties. The African Americans of the Congressional Black Caucus as part of the Democratic Party. And we discuss how African Americans left the Republican Party and started voting extremely faithfully in the 88 to 90 percentile, faithfully for the Democratic Party after the 60s, the passage of the civil rights legislation. So when we start to look at the traditional Democratic Party, ask yourself, since the 1960s, I'll say even 1970, since 1970 to 2020, 50 years, who has benefited the most from the traditional Democratic Party? Just take a look at your own personal life. Take a look at your own personal interests. Take a look at your own personal neighborhoods. Take a look at your cities that have Democratic governors, your states, Democratic mayors, Democratic legislators, Democratic city councils. Take a look and ask yourself, who's benefited from the traditional Democratic Party? Now, again, one thing about this particular report is that we don't tell you how to think. We don't tell you what to think. We simply give you the facts from historical, from a legislative, policy, law perspective, and societal perspective, and let you make the decision yourself. So again, take a look and ask yourself, who has benefited financially, job-wise, education-wise, social justice-wise, from an upward mobility standpoint, who's benefiting? These are the questions that the progressive are ask themselves. And this is the reason why the progressive arm of the Democratic Party are saying that we're not benefiting from this. We're not benefiting wholly based upon our vote that we're given. We're not benefiting. So therefore, we believe that the policies that we're advocating for as Democrats should be more progressive. It should go toward, again, issues of the people, issues of jobs, good jobs with livable wages, not minimum wages, but livable wages. Think about it. A livable wage is just smart business for our government and for society as a whole. Yeah, of course, companies with their margins may employ fewer individuals, but as a whole, individuals who are working will not rely upon social programs as much, which therefore decreases dependence upon the government itself. It's a quid pro quo. It's a perfect segue into creating a standard of living that we haven't seen since the turn of the Second World War, that we haven't seen since the creation of the Industrial Revolution. Think about that for a moment. Do you want a livable wage or just a minimum wage? Do you want to work 3 jobs? Forget 2. People are working 3 jobs, 2 regular jobs and a gig economy job, right? Which, many of us that grew up, African-American communities, poor communities, the gig economy existed as a way of life. We're just saying that now, that it exists for everybody else. But the progressive arm is saying that we need our Democratic elected officials to work for us. We need our Democratic elected officials to speak for us. We need our Democratic elected officials to represent the majority of the party, not the elite or the minority of the party. So that's why the progressives are holding on by a thread to the established Democratic Party. They've tried it twice. with Bernie Sanders. I don't think they're going to try it a third time in 2024. Now, let's take a look at the Republican Party, the Grand Old Party. It is a party that is old. As a matter of fact, they're dying from within. Most individuals that identify as the traditional conservatives of the Republican Party, those individuals are above 50 years old. As a matter of fact, they're way above 50 years old. And they don't have too many elections left in them. And not only that, but they don't have as many children coming behind them. And the Republican Party itself has stayed primarily one demographics, and that is Anglo-Saxon Protestant white Americans. They haven't really expanded out from that. So they're dying from within. This has been an issue that the Republican Party has started, it was raised, there were talks about it in committee rooms and outside in tight circles, but then it rose to the top in 2000. Matter of fact, it rose even more to a public crescendo with the election of President Barack Obama and the re-election of President Obama. If you look at the candidates that ran against him, the now late Senator McCain, Mitt Romney, they're saying, look, we got to diversify. But they've yet to start to do that. So you have a smaller party, a smaller demographics, a smaller cultural identity, a smaller group of individuals that believe that their country is slipping away from them when they have not grown the party out. So you've created this group of extremists, individuals within the Republican Party that had a candidate to run for president that spoke to them. And that's former President Donald J. Trump. He spoke to their issues. He spoke to their efforts. He spoke to their ideology. Now, I'm not saying that ideology was right. I think January 6th, 2021, the insurrection, Charlottesville, I think the botched planned capture of the governor of Michigan and also the governor of Virginia to execute them, and the botched insurrection to execute Vice President Pence and others. I think it shows that their ideology is separate from what the America we want to see. But keep in mind is that ideology that also existed that almost tore this country apart in 1861, called the United States Civil War. And it took the slaughter and the killing, the unnecessary killing of American citizens, brothers against brothers, cousins against cousins, North against South, in order to bring the country back together again, to say this is not the way we want to be. But he spoke to that ideology. He spoke to this being a country that doesn't exist anymore for us. So therefore, you have now 40 to 42% of Republican districts, congressional districts, that align with the Trump ideology, or what we call Trumpisms. And therefore, it's so hard for others to speak against this president because their voters believe in what he's saying. Is that a failure of expanding the message? Is there a failure of expanding the party through different demographics? Is there a failure of standing for conservative principles, classical conservative principles of Ronald Reagan and Abraham Lincoln? That's the thing. That's an issue that the Republican Party has to deal with right now. You can't deal with it later. It's on their doorstep right now. 2024, 2022 is knocking at the door. They have to deal with it. So, in taking a look at the outside people's movement of the two traditional parties of Republican and Democrats, taking a look at the progressive arm, the left of the Democratic Party, taking a look at the extremist arm of the right of the Republican Party, the question is not should a third party, a multi-party system exist in America, because it's there. it just hasn't been formed yet. But the people are there, and they're willing to form these separate parties. But the bigger question is, how will we work together in moving forward in our political system of a winner takes all in order to create this multi-party system? This has been this edition of the ClaVille Report. Are we ready for a third party, and how will it survive? We'll see you next time.